It is time to begin our Wednesday evening study, and we were able to get through our introductory material for 1 Kings the last time that we were gathered together, and we will now move into the text of 1 Kings and begin to work through the text, looking for lessons and how we can apply them to our life, but also, everything that was going on pertaining to God's people, to His kings who are ruling in this time. And we're going to move into this first section, but I went ahead, I know in the introduction I gave a outline there toward the end of the introduction, and I realized when I gave that outline, I gave these 4 specific points, but I didn't actually give you the verses that go along with that, so I was like, you know what, I'll just put it at the beginning of my slides if you want to write it down. But the book itself, as far as the major outline, you have King David's last days, which will be the first section that we're going to go into, that goes from the beginning of chapter 1 to chapter 2 and verse 12. And then one of the bigger sections found within the book of 1 Kings is Solomon's reign. It actually goes from chapter 2 and verse 13 all the way into chapter 11 and verse 43. Now, if you've noticed where it is the divided kingdom, it goes from 12:1 to 22:53, which is actually the end of 1 Kings. And the reason that I did that is because the divided kingdom actually continues all the way into the book of 2 Kings, ultimately until the point that Israel is led away and they are no more. And then all you have left is Judah until they're taken into captivity, and then 70 years later they return. But that's why it goes to the end of the book as it pertains to the divided kingdom, because that thought still continues. And then the last section is Elijah the prophet, essentially his ministry and his prophecy and some of the encounters he has with the kings that he is called to prophesy against. And that is chapter 17, verse 1 through chapter 22 and verse 3. So that's the kind of a simple outline, 4 major points. And hopefully you can kind of see what we're going to do as we move through the text. So this is our first heading, King David's last days. And then I'm going to break it down as we move through this text. The first section that we're going to look at is deceitful exaltation. So if you're actually writing this down, ultimately what you could have is this 2-page outline that I've made up by going through the text and breaking it down into these different sections, if you will. So you take the first heading, King David's last days. If you drop down, scoot over a little bit, put this deceitful exaltation, and then we're going to go to a more of a breakdown even within that. So hopefully you'll kind of see the pattern. We'll do this at every class, and you can somewhat formulate an outline for the entire book as we go through it. But we're going to go ahead and get into our text, starting there in 1 Kings chapter 1. If somebody will, go ahead and read verse 1 for us, please.
Now King David was old, advanced in years, and they put covers on him, but he could not get warm.
The first thing that you recognize immediately within this text is David's physical health has declined greatly, right? He is now to the point to where he is basically having to be warmed with a great abundance of blankets, and even that's still not doing it. Physically, he has gotten to a point to where he is very weak in his life. Now, he's actually only at 70 years old, which is kind of interesting when you think about some of the other leaders who have led God's people. How old was Moses in his time when he died? Anybody remember? 120, right? So he was much older. Abraham, you could even say, he was still very much in great shape even when he was near 100 years old, right? I mean, he also lived a lot longer life. I think part of the difference is when it compares to King David is the life that he lived. Remember, David is a man of war. David is a man who fought battle, and he did this regularly. And it may have something to do with his physical weakness now, but something I want us to recognize is just because he's portrayed as this man who is extremely weak physically, I don't think he's lost anything as it pertains to his mind. I think he's still very strong in the mind, and we'll see that as we move through the text. But we do have in 2 Samuel chapter 5 and verse 4, we have a reference to how long he actually reigned. He reigned 40 years as king, And he began his reign as a king at the age of 30. That gives us this understanding that he is 70 years old. And the decline of his physical health is evident, but in the introduction, I made a comment about the fact that it seems like maybe a little bit of time has passed from the end of 2 Samuel to the beginning of 1 Kings. Does anybody remember the last time that there was something said about him in his physical state in the book of 2 Samuel? You remember when they were at battle against the Philistines in 2 Samuel chapter 21 and verse 15?
Stay in the gates.
You remember what the text said about David at that point? That he grew weary. But there's a vast difference between a man in battle growing weary when he is fighting with a sword and he's fighting these other men to the point that he is in this bed and he can't actually maintain any kind of warmth. Right? That's the point to where David is at this particular time. This man of war, this great battle hero, this great leader of God's people is now to a point to where he is practically bedridden. Let's go ahead and look at verses 2 through 4. If somebody will read verses 2 through 4.
Therefore his servant said to him, let a young woman, a virgin, be sought for our lord the king, and let her stand before the king, and let her care for him, and let her lie in your bosom, that our lord the king may be warm. So they sought for a lovely young woman throughout all the territory of Israel, and found Abishag the Shunammite, and brought her to the king.
Go ahead and give verse 4 too, please, sir.
The young woman was very lovely, and she cared for the king and served him, but the king did not know her.
Thank you. So the plan of David's servants is, well, the king is to a point to where he's bedridden. He's not even able to maintain body heat, essentially. So their idea is that they're going to find this young virgin, and she's going to basically be there at his side to the point to where she will lie with him in his bosom and help him to maintain his body warmth. She's going to serve him. Now, anything that you might pick up and read, almost everything as it pertains to this text immediately goes to some sort of sexual thought as far as David and Abishag. And I don't know that I fully buy that line of thinking. I think there's probably more to it than just that kind of thinking. You see, some of the people, did you say something?
No, every time I read it irritates me, so I'm just waiting for you.
Okay.
Well, I
Well,
don't understand as many wives as this man had. Why did they have to go find a virgin?
well, and I hope we can bring out some, maybe some thoughts as to what the purpose was here. And again, I'm kind of just working through it myself, and anything you look at has these wild ideas. Now, go ahead and tell you a couple of them just to see kind of where most people's train of thinking is as it relates to this text. It's widely believed to be pertaining to attempt to revitalize the king by some sort of relationship with this younger woman. And some even go as far as saying if the king could not actually have a physical relationship with this woman, that it would prove that he was no longer able to rule by himself and he would have to have a co-ruler along beside him. And I don't believe that would be the case either. I don't think that's true. Well, in ancient traditions, they say that if you take an older individual who is weak in their spirit, weak in their health, and you allow someone who is much younger to be right there close to them, ultimately they will somewhat feed off of that youthful spirit, and it'll help them to kind of revitalize, if you will. Now, that's some ancient practices. But again, I don't know that I fully buy in to that one either. So you have to ask the question, okay, what's the deal here? What's going on? Why do they go and they find this young virgin to lie with the king? So I'm going to throw it out there, and let's see what kind of ideas or thoughts that we might have pertaining to this current situation. Okay?
Well, I always thought, because of this, because he was the king, and if he was to not have some virgin, the king did not know her, so he did not have sex with her.
Right.
So if you take a woman that wasn't a virgin, and you put her in this position, what's to say that she wouldn't get pregnant by somebody else and then come and say, well, now I'm pregnant with the king's child, my child needs to be put in line with the royalty,
Right.
and now I need to be treated with royalty.
Right.
And so it keeps, by having a virgin in that position, someone who's still pure and is going to be pure after the king dies, it eliminates that fraud
Right.
that could be placed upon the king on his deathbed.
I think that's not a bad thought there. I think there's something to that. Anybody else? Any thoughts?
I just don't understand, like, he had wives. Why
Mm-hmm.
would one of them not work? They have a warm body too.
Well, and one of the things I thought about as it pertains to his wives, most of his wives would probably be somewhat to the same age as he is. They would at least be up in their upper age, and maybe the thought is that someone who is younger might provide more body warmth. I'm not sure. I could see easily that some of his wives might be very close to his own age. Therefore, maybe even suffering from similar problems just the same. So bring in someone who is younger, maybe, that's just a thought, I'm not sure. But what about the idea of it being and I think Aaron was kind of hitting on this, but what other reasons could we think of it being a virgin? Yes, sir.
Do we know his wives were still alive?
Well, we know one of them is. We're going to see her come up here soon in the text. We'll see Bathsheba come up in the text. But, again, we don't know what their current physical state is, what their health is like.
Relationship was.
Right. And,
I was thinking, by now, probably all of his wives don't like him.
well, and part of it that we have to kind of consider is the fact that this person who's going to be there is a servant. Now, bedside servant in the sense that he's bedridden, it's almost like a bedside nurse, right? This is an individual who's going to be pretty busy, if I was to guess, getting everything that he needs going back and forth, right? But I think also the idea with it being a virgin, we have to look at the fact that a virgin is recognized as someone who is pure, undefiled. Where, like what Aaron was talking about a while ago, if they just got some random woman who was married to somebody else, how would that look? That would be recognized as something that was not pure, that would be undefiled. Plus, there would be other motives that could drive them to trying to do something, and we've already seen familial ties that are kind of corrupt, right? So that possibility, yes.
One thing too, maybe the fact that they wanted someone that didn't have a family to take care of, that would only just be centered on him.
Mm-hmm.
Because she wouldn't have anything else, there's not a husband involved, there's not kids,
Right.
and virgins usually do that.
I think that's right down the line of thinking more than likely. Yes, sir.
I was just gonna say, is the body gets older, then you start to have problems with circulation in your body, which is what provides the body heat. And so a younger person could provide enough for themselves and for him too.
Right. I think all of these things that we have been discussing are all kind of tying together for the reasoning. I think that this younger individual, like you say, would have, it would be easier for them to provide him warmth. It would be easier for this younger person to go back and forth and get anything that he needs to be a servant for him, a bedside nurse essentially. And you find someone who does not have a husband or children like you're talking about, they can devote their full attention to King David. And remember, he is the king, he's highly respected, and they're going to get someone that can really take care of him and everything that he needs. Well, if you were to bring in somebody who is family, you think about some of the problems we've already seen within his family, right? If you bring a family member in, all of a sudden you might have somebody saying, hey, well, you know what, we could take advantage of this situation, and we're going to see that as we move through the text. So I think picking this individual who is a virgin, who is young, is more just the best person that fits the job to tend to David's every need. And it doesn't have anything to do with a sexual relationship that I see. And just like the text says, and like Aaron mentioned, he knew her not. I mean, it tells us within the text there was nothing like that. I think this was just the person who was best fit to provide for his every need and be able to care for him like he needed to be cared for. He was still highly respected, and they were going to give him the best of service or best of care that he could possibly get. I think, in my mind, that is pretty well the best reasoning that I can come up with. I don't know if that suits what you're looking for there, Dina. I know I struggled with this part of the text, and then my next thing is, why is this part of the text in here? Yeah. And we'll get into that here in a minute. But let's go ahead and consider. You look at what we're fixing to go into with chapter 5 and following. Adonijah is fixing to rebel against King David ultimately, and he's fixing to try and move himself right into the position as king, much like Absalom did. So what exactly is this part of the text in here for? Right? If you go over to the Chronicles and you look in the same section as far as pertaining to the same time frame, there's no mention of this interaction with Adonijah. There's no mention of seeking out this young virgin to care for King David. All of this is kind of passed over. So, which that happens a lot in the Chronicles. Bathsheba's incident and David's incident together was not in the Chronicles either. It's more focused on the good things. So then why would the Kings, as far as the author of the Kings, put this at the very beginning? It's a strange way to open a book, if you think about it. Well, yes, ma'am.
Was that the way of introducing this young girl, because she's the one that he wanted to marry her?
Ultimately, yes. I think that's part of it.
I think that's probably why she's mentioned here, so you can see the connection why his request was turned down.
Right. And I think another part of that, and I think that's a good line of thinking, but another part of that, and that's why I chose this heading for this section, is opportune circumstances. Look at what Adonijah is fixing to do. Realize where King David is at physically. He can't even leave his bed. Right? So Adonijah looking in is ultimately like a vulture circling, fixing to take advantage of the situation. That's just my line of thinking. This is provided somewhat so we can see, okay, well, here's Adonijah. He's looking in from the outside. He says, I have an opportunity here, and I'm fixing to take advantage of this. And that's pretty much exactly what he does. But let's go ahead and let's move into this next section, verses 5 through 10, political moves, verses 5 through 10. If somebody will, please read verses 5 and 6.
Then Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, I will be king. And he prepared for himself chariot and horsemen and 50 men to run before him. And his father had not rebuked him at any time by saying, Why have you done so? He was very good looking. His mother had borne him after Absalom.
Well, we immediately see what Adonijah's thought process is here. He exalts himself, saying, I will be king. And he prepares for himself chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him. He's seizing the opportunity, if you will. Now, is it possible that Adonijah is just seeing his rightful position to the throne? All right, well, you think about it in the time frame, who is the oldest remaining son currently? All right, look back to 2 Samuel chapter 3, verses 2 through 4. There is one son that is mentioned within the text here that we really don't have any information about exactly where he is at this time. So most believe that he's likely dead just the same. But 2 Samuel chapter 3, beginning in verse 2, sons were born to David. His first son, Amnon, right? So he's the first. The second son, this one, Chileab. The third, Absalom. And then the fourth, Adonijah. Well, Ammon, we remember his incident with Tamar, and we remember the anger that aroused with Absalom. Ultimately, Ammon is killed in 2 Samuel chapter 13 in verse 28, where Absalom actually tells these other servants, when he is merry on wine, essentially when he is drunk, you strike him and you kill him. And they did just that. So the first son, he's out of the picture. And then you have the second, this Chileab. And also in 1 Chronicles chapter 3 and verse 1, there's a reference to him as well, also calling him Daniel. So there's two names that go with this guy, but there's nowhere else in the text that you find anything about this individual. And I even went ahead and asked Preston about this earlier. I was like, hey, could you find any more information about him when you were studying this? And he didn't either. So most people assume, okay, well, the second son, he's not mentioned again anywhere else in text. Odds are this one is also deceased. Well, then you get to Absalom the third. And in 2 Samuel chapter 18 and verse 15, he also was killed. So, Adonijah is, traditionally speaking, the rightful heir to the kingdom. Do you think that he was actually just following what he thought was tradition in what he's about to do?
No, because if he was, he could have done it the right way. He didn't have to be so sneaky.
Yep, exactly right. I don't think for a minute that he he maybe told other people that. That might have been how he, got some of his followers. But I think there is definitely some deceitful behavior, and we'll see it in the text as we move through. Yes, sir.
Just thinking about Absalom and how he tried to overthrow, sounds a lot similar with the men and the chariots. So just pointing back to someone else who was doing evil.
Right. You're actually in my next section of the notes. The similarities, he was talking about the similarities that are seen between Absalom and Adonijah. And one of the things that I think we need to bring out, you obviously see within this text, and like Jesse just said, the first thing that Adonijah does is he gets himself these chariots, and he gets these horsemen, and he gets 50 men to run before him and parade himself around, essentially, much like Absalom did, right? He's basically going to go out and he says, I'm going to take this kingship, and I'm going to make these people begin to follow me, right? Well, the second thing that we could mention, and it's kind of interesting that it's here, but it says he's very good looking. You see that in verse 6? You remember even the first king that was chosen for God's people? When the people chose a king, one of the things that was mentioned about King Saul was he was very good looking. He was a head taller than any of the rest of the men. He was very good looking. Well, also, even with Absalom, you remember what was said? He was very good looking. So even in that time frame, something about appearance, would immediately give some the thought, well, this just might be someone who's good to rule for us as a king. Well, Adonijah also has these looks. He was also very good looking. His mother had borne him after Absalom. But what's really interesting within verse 6 to me is the idea that he enjoyed a little bit too much of his father's favor. Did you catch that part in verse 6 where it says, or in verse 6, where it says, and his father had not rebuked him at any time by saying, why have you done so? Never once had he ever rebuked him, right? He's never been questioned about anything that he has done, whether wrong, whether right. He just hasn't rebuked him. There's been no sort of discipline of any kind. Yes, sir.
Well, he was a full brother to Absalom. So they were raised by the same mother. So there could be influence there.
Possibly, but that it's hard to say as far as how that part of it would go. But I find it real interesting, and if you look back through the text and even back in the study, if you remember in 2 Samuel, do you remember when Amnon, what he did to Tamar? Do you remember what the text said about David after the fact? It said he was angry, but it didn't say that he did anything to him. No rebuke. And it's strange because right after it says David was angry, then the text moves to a few years later, 2 years later, Absalom did this. So it just kind of jumps right away from that, and it doesn't say that there was any rebuke whatsoever. Well, what about Absalom? In 2 Samuel chapter 18, in verse 5, if you look back to that, when Absalom had pulled his stunts, you know what David said to his men concerning Absalom? He said, be very gentle with the boy. Don't be harsh to him. He didn't want them to rebuke him firmly. And it shows a pattern that he didn't actually show any kind of rebuke toward his children. And now you have Adonijah in this position where he's like, okay, well, here's an opportunity. The king's not going to rebuke me. My dad's not going to rebuke me. I'm going to go for it. And I think it somewhat fuels, it's a shortcoming of David, but ultimately I think it somewhat is part of what fuels Adonijah's thought where, you know what, I can go for this and likely I can get away with this. A lack of discipline.
You see that, like, was it Eli? He didn't discipline his sons either to destruction.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you could easily think of the verses, the one that spares the rod, ultimately it's connected to hating their child because they spare the rod, right? Because we're not, tending to them as we should. Yes, sir.
It's funny that we mentioned where it says his father had not rebuked him. It doesn't specifically say his mother didn't rebuke him.
Right.
It says his father did. And going back to the verse where you talk about sparing the rod, it says he hates his son. It doesn't say, so it shows the influence and the responsibility that fathers have. That side of child rearing as well.
Right, absolutely. And it's one of those things that often, a lot of the times is somewhat overlooked. It's not fun. It's not pleasurable by any means. We don't want to have to do it, but ultimately, if we care about the person that they're going to grow up to be, decisions that they're going to make later in life, we have to make sure that we are given the proper discipline. And you see it, here in this, and ultimately with 3 of David's sons that we know of for sure up to this point where he was lacking in that area, and 3 of them doing very wicked things as it pertains to choices in their life. Any other thoughts before we move to the next set of verses? No? All right, somebody, if you will, read verses 7 through 9. Verses 7 through 9.
Then he conferred with Joab, the son of Zeruiah.
Zariah.
And with Abiathar the priest, and they followed and helped. I picked the wrong verses.
Adonijah.
Adonijah.
I gave you a tough one.
But Zadok the priest, Benaiah the son of
Jehoiada.
Nathan the prophet, Shimei, Rai, and the mighty men who belonged to David were not with
Adonijah.
And Adonijah sacrificed the sheep and oxen and fattened cattle by the stone of Zaheleth, which is by Enrogel. He also invited all of his brothers, the king's sons, and all of the men of Judah, the king's servants. But he did not invite Nathan the prophet, Benaiah the mighty men, or Solomon his brother.
I think you got the toughest section of the reading with all the names, but you did good. Thank you for that reading. Now, this is kind of where my mind goes as far as this political moves. Right? We already know Adonijah's motive. We know why, and kind of, his process, his thought process now. I'm going to overtake the kingdom. I see my opportunity. David is weak. He's not leaving his bed, essentially. This is my best opportunity to take over the kingdom. But what do you have to do if you're going to begin to try and take over a kingdom? You got to get followers, right? You're going to have some support. So the first thing that you see in verse 7, then he conferred with Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and with Abiathar, the priest, and they followed and helped Adonijah. So you have to ask, well, these are the first 2 that he went and he got to follow him. So what is the importance behind these 2 individuals?
One's the commander of the army and the other one's the priest.
The priest, that's right. And if you think about it, if you're going to begin to gain this following, what better 2 people are you going to need than a religious leader and a military leader? So his first 2, that's where he's going, right? And he's going to pose somewhat of a formidable threat by gaining these 2 men on his side. Now, sir? Especially those 2. You think about Joab. I mean, he is scattered all throughout 2 Samuel, right? And he's been a military leader. He's bounced back and forth. He's had a lot of interaction with some of the deaths that we saw in the previous chapter. There's a lot going on with him. So then you have to question, okay, well, why would they immediately follow after Adonijah? Yes, sir.
These are 2 men that have fallen out of favor with David.
Right.
So he's going to his father's enemies.
And they think
take over his father's kingdom with it.
they think they're going to be first in command
He's not
after.
going after the current people that are still on David's side,
Right.
or who has God's approval.
Right.
And so,
And this is where, even in the question asked earlier, do you think, when I was saying, do you think Adonijah was just saying, okay, well, I should be king because I'm next in line? Or is he actually plotting and trying to do this? He's plotting. And you can see it because he begins to choose certain individuals. But then when we get into the next verse, all of a sudden you start seeing a difference of some that are not following. And then by the time you get into verse 10, there's these specific ones that he does not invite. And there's reason behind that too. But you got to look now, okay, well, you got these 2 individuals who are following. Now let's look at who is left out, who is not following. Verse 8, you have Zadok the priest, Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, Nathan the prophet, Shimei, Rai, and the mighty men who belonged to David were not with Adonijah. Now, just because it says that they were not with Adonijah, I don't know if that necessarily means that he never actually approached them. Because actually, if you look in verse 10, it says, but he did not invite Nathan. That's one of those in that list. And he did not invite Benaiah or the mighty men. But there's still other names in that list that are not found of the ones that he did not invite. So he might have tried to invite them as well, and they might have turned him down. Maybe their loyalty to King David, I'm not sure. You know, that's kind of assumption here. Yes, sir.
You wonder how far back this political intrigue, this web that they're weaving goes, because he invited the man and killed his brother, who was the rightful heir.
Mm-hmm.
Joab.
Yeah.
Remember, Joab had to do with Absalom's death.
Right.
When David said, don't
Yeah.
kill
And
him,
he, yeah.
Joab had him killed.
Mm-hmm.
And here he is now picking Joab to help him. And it just.
Oh yeah,
I've watched too many movies, but I wonder how far back the plot goes that we're
Right.
not given of family intrigue, of how far back
Yeah.
he was positioning himself to.
It's all about power and authority.
Absalom and Adonijah didn't like each other.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. I mean that, or Joab was in on.
It's
making
a
him the king.
It's a power grab, you know. It's a power grab, and the decisions that are being made, like you said, who knows, you know, how long he's been plotting this out. But the time has come where he has his best opportunity to make this happen, and now he's on the move, and he's picking his followers essentially, and he's got this following that is beginning to follow right there along with him. Now, Zadok was another priest, of course, so you still have a priest who is going to be siding with David. You have Benaiah. That was one of David's administrators. He was a warrior of sorts. Remember, if I'm not mistaken, he was the one that had slayed lions. He was listed with the mighty men of David, so he probably has a great sense of loyalty to David, likely why Adonijah didn't actually go to him. Nathan the prophet has always been one that was loyal to David, right? There's always been that good relationship to him. Shimei, this is, if I'm not mistaken, possibly, from what I understand, the same one that possibly David spared in 2 Samuel. I'm not 100% sure about that, but there was a one man who was cursing David, essentially, and then his men wanted to kill him, and then he said, no, don't kill him. He spared his life. And I don't know if this is the same one. I would have to study that out a little bit further, but that's the closest Shimei that I remember in the text. And then you have this other mention of this Rai. I couldn't find anything else on this individual. This is kind of a new name that pops up. But the mighty men, of course, we remember to 2 Samuel chapter 23, verses 8 and following, also men that would have had great loyalty to David. So these individuals that seem very loyal to David, of course, they're still following David. But he does have two prominent men that are following him, and the text then goes on to say, ultimately, he begins to offer up sacrifices, which would be common when bringing in someone else to reign in position as king. There would be feasts and things of that nature that would take place. So all of that seems pretty common. But when you look back into the middle of that text and you look at verse 9, and it says, at the stone of Zaholeth, which is by in Rogel. Now, what I found out on this specific location is this is somewhat south of Jerusalem, and it's somewhat remote. So it's not a place that is heavily populated, but there's enough people there where he can somewhat begin to get this uprising of followers without being to the point that people in Jerusalem were actually understanding what was going on. So it's kind of a strategic location, even in his choosing, of where to begin to offer these sacrifices and things of that nature. And it's all rooted in secrecy. And okay, I want people to follow me, but at the moment I don't need too many people knowing about this, right? So it's very deceitful in all of his actions thus far. So you get down to verse 10, and now here's the no invites, right? He did not invite these. Nathan the prophet, and we just talked about him, his loyalty to David. Benaiah, one of his mighty men. Also the rest of the mighty men. But then he throws in there Solomon, his brother. Now, remember in the previous verse, at the end of it, he says, he also invited all his brothers, the king's sons, and all the men of Judah, the king's servants. So all the rest of the brothers seem to get the invite to this gathering, but Solomon does not. Why do you think Solomon did not get the invite?
Because he's there. I mean, he's in line to become king after David.
Do you think Solomon knows at this point that he's going to reign?
He's known since the time of birth that he would, they've all known that Solomon would take
Well,
over for David.
early on it was said, if I remember correctly, early on it was prophesied that one of David's sons would reign. But if I'm not mistaken, and y'all might be able to correct me in 2 Samuel, I don't remember any instance where David actually specifically told Solomon. I'm trying to remember now, I'm thinking about that. Actually, there was, let's see.
Just know.
But Bathsheba was his favorite wife.
Yes.
And so, needless to say,
Well, in the prophecy that I'm recalling in the Davidic promise was one of your sons will reign, ultimately. He's going to be the one that will build the temple, but the name's not mentioned. It's just said a son of yours. Did I see another hand, Miss Sue?
One of the prophets knew Bathsheba's son would be the king.
I'm trying to remember, has it actually been mentioned to Solomon is what I'm trying to recall. And when you look over to the Chronicles around the same time frame, there's a lot more information where David, and I think that Solomon does know at this point, but there's a lot more information to where David is actually telling Solomon, okay, this is what you're going to do, this is what's in store. But he also, it goes to the point of saying that David was telling the people, I want you to support Solomon just like you have supported me. Now, we're also going to run into something similar to that as we move a little bit further into the book of Kings. So it's hard to say if that was prior to this incident here, because this is not actually in the other text. Yes?
It says that when David originally promised Bathsheba that Solomon would be king, you find it in 1 Chronicles 28.
28. And the text I'm thinking about, the early conversations that he had with Solomon, I think goes back to like chapter 22 or chapter 23 of 1 Chronicles. But there's some things that are left out in different places in the Chronicles that are found in the Kings, so it makes it kind of hard to follow the timeline of when exactly everything took place, because the Chronicles don't say anything about Adonijah in this attempt at a rebellion either, that I recall. So it's hard to say, well, is that before or after? Because we're going to see mention of Bathsheba and Nathan going to King David and saying, didn't you promise that Solomon would be king? So we know that there was this communication between Bathsheba and David. The big question is, did Solomon know? Did Adonijah know? Is that the reason that Adonijah did not invite Solomon to this gathering? And I think it is. I think that they both knew. I think that Adonijah very much does not want him to know anything about it, so he can claim the throne like Absalom tried, right? He keeps him out of the picture, claim it before David actually puts him in this position. So bouncing back between the two, between the Chronicles and the Kings, it's hard to follow the timeline, but I do think that he knows about what's actually going on. And I think that's why ultimately he was like, you know what, I'm not inviting him. Everybody else was invited. So there had to be a reason behind it, and I think they both knew. And I think Solomon knew just the same. So that finishes out that little bit of section of text. So the next section, and we'll just barely get into this because our time is just about up, but the remainder of this section from verse 11 to 27 is now the counter moves. Basically, this is going to be focused on Bathsheba and Nathan and conversations that they have, and then their plan of, okay, how are we going to counter the things that Adonijah is trying to do? And ultimately, they wind up going to the king one by one and talking with the king and bringing to his remembrance, you've already said that Solomon is going to be king. So what's going on here in allowing Adonijah to take this stand? Well, I don't think the king even knew what was going on. I don't think he had any idea. And that's why Adonijah chose this time frame.
he had some young virgin in his bosom distracted him from everything else. So
Well, I don't
think he had any idea of
I don't
anything going
think-
on outside of his bedchamber.
I don't think even in his physical shape that, I think he would have looked to her as just someone who is helping him in his weakness.
Yeah,
It wasn't
he had
any
no
kind
idea
of,
what's going on
you know,
outside his room.
he was being taken care of. I mean, she was like a bedside nurse essentially, and that's how he saw her. So there wouldn't have been any kind of awkwardness to that. But he doesn't know anything else is going on because he can't get out of his room essentially, right? But remember, you know, earlier on in discussing his physical health, I'd mentioned to think about his mental health, right? We talked about his physical health. I think David is still very much sound of mind. I don't think that is lacking at all. And we'll see that as we begin to see some of the conversation that David has with Bathsheba and the conversation that he has with Nathan. And he immediately takes charge and begins to put things in play to move Solomon in as king. And he begins to give instruction to Solomon, reminding him of the importance to follow after the Lord and don't turn away from him, telling him the things that he's going to need to do at the beginning of his reign. He still remembers everything, the prophecies that were spoke of your son who's going to build the temple. He still remembers these things. He's still very sound up here. Physically, he's just a whole lot weaker. We only have a minute by my watch. We're probably just going to call it there. I appreciate your attention, and then we'll jump into this next section in our next study.